For this lesson, I'm going to mention a few things, and that is when you try to invert quadratics, we're going to switch the variables, then solve for y. Okay, so I'll explain what that means in a moment. And then once we solve, we're going to end up taking the square root of both sides of the equation, which reminds you that you have to include plus or minus, and once you remove plus or minus, once you remove the absolute value, then you have to write plus or minus. So I'm gonna go over these 4 examples, and hopefully this lesson will be easy to understand. Also, this here is very important. Okay, this is telling you that the values of x are restricted for this quadratic function, which means since this is less than or equal to 0, that means we're only using the left side of the parabola. So when you take the square root, you take, this implies that you'll be using the negative square root of x, or whatever is inside of the radical, okay? So with that said, what I'm going to do first is I'm going to switch the x and the y variables. So then this becomes x equals y squared plus 2. That's the first step, okay? Once you have switched x and y, then result means we're going to solve for y. So we need to get the y by itself. Since there's a plus 2, we subtract that 2 from both sides of the equation. So minus 2 on this side and minus 2 on the left side. So then the left side becomes x minus 2 is equal to y squared. So now once we get the y by itself, notice that we don't want to know what y squared is equal to. We want y by itself. So then to cancel the square, or to undo the square, we take the inverse of the square, which is the square root. So then once we take the square root, we say square root of x minus 2 is equal to, now watch this, is equal to the absolute value of y. So that's what I mean by this. You include the absolute value, okay? Once we take the absolute value, then we can remove the absolute value, but we have to include plus or minus the square root of x minus 2, and that is equal to y. So once we have this equation, then we need to switch the language or vocabulary or notation. So instead of y, I'm going to write that as f inverse of x is equal to, now notice again, we said we can only use the negative square root. So I'm going to use the negative, not the positive. So equals negative square root of x minus 2. So the only difference between this answer and this one is that this is function notation. This one is not, okay? So then I'm going to go back and box in my answer to let you know that I'm finished with this example. So let's go on to example number 2. For example number 2, same thing. Now notice again, I'm being restricted on the values of x that I can use, and this is saying I can only use the values of x that are greater than or equal to 0. So if you think of the parabola, we can only use the right side of it. Okay, so this side of the parabola, which means this tells you that we can only use the positive square root. So when we take the square root, we have to keep that in mind. Okay, so let's go over this one. Same process. I'm going to switch the y and the x. So then this is x equals 9 y squared minus 4. Okay. We want to solve for y, so that means we need to get the y by itself. There is some minus 4. Let's add that 4 to both sides of the equation. So then this side becomes x plus 4 is equal to 9y squared. Okay, from here, we don't want 9y squared. We want the y by itself, so we are going to divide by that 9 on both sides of the equation. So divide by 9 here, and left and right. So then this 9 reduces. So now we have x plus 4 over 9 is equal to y squared. Again, we're not interested in y squared. We want the y by itself. So to undo the square, we take the square root. So take the square root of this side, and watch what I'm going to do here. I'm going to take the square root of x plus 4 and the square root of 9, because 9 is a perfect square. Okay, so then this side becomes the square root of x plus 4 over the square root of 9 is 3, and this is equal to, again, don't forget, the absolute value of y. Okay, so if we want to remove the absolute value, then we have to include plus or minus square root of x plus 4 over 3 is equal to y. So we are done finding the inverse. We just switch to function notation, but keep in mind again, we can only use the right side of the quadratic, which means only the positive square root. Okay, so we don't have to write the positive, just write, it's implied to be positive if you write it in the following way. So f inverse of x is equal to square root of x plus 4 over 3, and this is the answer to example number 2. So I'm going to go into example number 3. So for this one again, you always have to pay attention to the restriction that we are being given here. So this is all the values of x that are greater than or equal to 6. Again, that implies positive numbers, so that means we are using the right side of the parabola. So we use the right side, then that tells you that you can only use the positive square root, not the negative. Okay, so I'm writing the plus, but you don't have to write a plus. That's just me reinforcing that it's a positive square root. So again, let's repeat again. Instead of y, this becomes x equals, open parentheses, y minus 6 squared. So now notice this problem. You only have y minus 6, but both are on the side of the parentheses, and you got to take the square. So then from here, we can right away take the square root from both sides. So then this gives you the square root of x is equal to the absolute value of y minus 6. And once we remove the absolute value, then we have to say plus or minus the square root of x is equal to y minus 6. Again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get the y by itself. So let's add the 6 to both sides of the equation. So plus 6 on this side. Okay. So then I have, that's a positive 6. So this becomes 6 plus or minus the square root of x is equal to y. So now we have the y by itself. Again, look at the restriction. We cannot use the negative square root, so then I'm just going to use the positive square root of x for this function to do the inverse. So then the inverse is, this is what, this means the inverse function. So the inverse of this function here is 6 plus the square root of x. And that's the answer to example number 3. Okay, let's go to example number 4. So for example number 4, again, let's pay attention to the fact that we are being told by this symbol here that we can only use the values of x that are less than or equal to 4. So that tells you that we are using the left side of the parabola, which means when you take the inverse, when you find the inverse, it implies that you can only use the negative square root. So don't forget, if it's the left side, that corresponds to the negative square root. If it's the right side, that corresponds to the positive square root. Okay, so to that end, let's switch the x and y. X equals 2 times y minus 4 squared. So this one here again, we need to get what's inside of the parentheses. It's binomial by itself. There's a 2 in front of it. Let's divide by that 2. So I'm going to divide by 2 on both sides of the equation. So then this becomes x over 2 is equal to, now we have y minus 4 squared. Okay, so that is the first step. Once we have this isolated, then we cancel the square by taking the inverse of it, which is the square root. So square root of x over 2. So then this gives us the square root of x over 2 is equal to, again, don't forget, absolute value of y minus 4. And once we remove the absolute value, we have to include plus or minus in front of the square root. So then plus or minus the square root of x over 2 is equal to y minus 4. Okay, we have one more step to get the y by itself, and that is to add this 4 to both sides of the equation. So then this becomes 4 plus or minus the square root of x over 2 is equal to y. So we are done by getting y by itself. So the next step is we pay attention to what this is saying. We can only use the left side, so that means we can only use the negative square root. Okay, so then I'm going to choose to use the negative square root, not the positive. And then I'm going to do the inverse. So the inverse of this function, the inverse of that function that we were given is f inverse of x is equal to 4 minus the square root of x, and let me write this better, minus square root of x over 2. And this is the answer to example number 4.